Thank you, participants. We already have over 100 people in the room. So I think we are at the 5 minutes mark. So we will start. Welcome everybody to our webinar in commemoration of Zero Discrimination Day. My name is Lesego Twaile and I'm the Communications Manager at GNP+. Before we can start, there's a few housekeeping rules that I'd like to point out. So to the speakers, please keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking. And when you are indeed speaking, please keep to the time. I think we have about 10 minutes or so for each speaker. Please make sure to keep to time so that we can be on time with our webinar and also leave room for Q&As. We will try a non-invasive way to say time's up, but we trust that you'll keep to time. And the webinar will be recorded and is currently live streamed on the GNP Plus Facebook page and will be cross-posted on the UNAIDS page and the HIV Justice Network. To all our Voice Plus users, please use our app to chat about the discussions on the Not a Criminal campaign platform in the app. And there's also interpretation in Spanish and French. Please make sure that you navigate to the globe sign and choose the language that you would like to listen to the webinar in. And you can also submit questions as the webinar goes. If you have any question for a particular speaker, please specify in the Q&A box to say this question is to what's Tinashe or any of our speakers, and then we will try and attend it with time. Thank you so much for joining us, and then I'll hand over to our facilitator for the day, Tinashe.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our Zero Discrimination Day webinar under the banner Changing Harmful Laws is a Must, Save Lives, Decriminalize. My name is Tinashe Rufurwadzo. I'm the Global Communications Manager at Prevention Access Campaign. This webinar is brought to you by the co-conveners of the Global Partnership to Eliminate HIV-Related Stigma and Discrimination, the HIV Justice Worldwide Coalition, and the Not a Criminal campaign. Yesterday was HIV Not a Crime Awareness Day in the United States, where our colleagues in the US took the opportunity to raise awareness and knowledge about HIV criminalization and to fight unjust and harmful laws that target people because of their HIV status. Today, we are celebrating Zero Discrimination Day globally. Criminalization enables and reinforces discrimination and is undoubtedly one of the greatest threats to our safety, our fight to end AIDS. It is a strong statement that so many of us are here today, focusing on this critical topic. Together, we are powerful in our fight for decriminalization. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the UNAIDS Deputy Executive Director, Stegling, who is responsible for policy, advocacy, and knowledge, to give us an opening remark. Chrissy, we are extremely excited to have you with us on this community-led webinar. You are one of us, and it is really fitting that you are opening our webinar today. We know that your passion lies in the field of human rights and the global partnership to eliminate stigma and discrimination, and it's exactly that. It is a critical vehicle for action to mobilize all countries to reach the 10-10-10 targets. It is how we are working together to put for the removal of HIV-related human rights barriers and inequalities across the 6 settings. So really, I couldn't think of anyone, Chrissy, who can warm our participants and also our speakers to this webinar. It's over to you, Chrissy.
Thank you, Tinashe. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And let me begin by thanking GNP Plus for organizing this important and timely webinar, focusing on the need to address harmful laws and challenging environments undermining the HIV response. I also want to say hello to old friends and new friends and my fellow panelists and all of you who have joined online. I've seen many familiar names in the chat. I'm very glad that you have joined us all today. I'm particularly delighted that some of my old friends from LEGABIBO are here to share the story of Botswana, which I'm very proud to have had a small contribution to in an earlier life, which feels like now a very distant life. But yeah, I'm glad that we get to hear a little bit about that story. Decriminalization, as you know, is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I'm grateful to be here with you, especially today on Zero Discrimination Day, a day when we celebrate everyone's right to live a life free of discrimination and violence, with full protection of their human rights and gender rights, so they may enjoy physical and mental well-being, and most importantly, so that they may enjoy dignity that we all have a right to. It is also a day on which to showcase our strong and collective commitment to ending HIV-related stigma, discrimination, criminalization, and to highlight the intersecting inequalities fueling AIDS and other pandemics. We often say that we have the tools required to end AIDS. We have effective prevention and treatment for HIV, but what we don't have is sufficient political will or the resources necessary for removing the societal barriers preventing us from delivering those tools to all in need. Among the toughest barriers that many of us have learned over the years are punitive and criminal laws that keep people from seeking life-saving care, and that keeps people from participating fully and freely in society. In the past decade, we've made huge strides forward in HIV prevention and treatment, but those advances are not enjoyed equally. And I'm always shocked when I have to say that sentence, but new HIV infections among key populations, when we look at the global picture, have not reduced since 2010. If we are to end AIDS for key populations and ensure all people living with HIV can live with dignity, we must have a human rights response, and punitive laws must be changed. There is a direct correlation between criminal laws and the perpetuation of AIDS. Evidence shows that when drug use and possession for small amounts of drugs for personal use is decriminalized, new HIV infections drop sharply. People are able to access harm reduction and other health programs, and reports of stigma and discrimination decrease significantly. And yet, in too many countries, people who use drugs continue to be criminalized. I'd like to recognize the champions. I think you have already noted them, Tinashe and others, behind the hashtag Not a Criminal campaign, a critical advocacy effort calling for the decriminalization of HIV, non-disclosure, exposure and transmission, same-sex relationships, sex work and drug use. Your work, which we'll hear more about today, is effectively driving some of the change that we need to see. UNAIDS is leading efforts on decriminalization too. Recognizing the correlation between the removal of these laws and accelerated progress against AIDS, UNAIDS included specific targets relating to criminal and punitive laws in the global AIDS strategy. These targets need to be achieved by 2025 to enable us to end AIDS by 2030. But we do know that the removal of punitive laws is not easy, but it is necessary for ending AIDS. And we have, thankfully, multiple recent examples that it is possible. In the last few years, harmful laws have been overturned around the world. More countries decriminalized same-sex sexual activity in 2022 than in any previous year. Last year, Zimbabwe and the Central African Republic changed their laws on HIV criminalization. Belgium decriminalized sex work, and Thailand and Liberia moved closer to decriminalize drug use. But we also sadly continue to see examples of bad legislation, like the one proposed in Uganda just recently, where the so-called anti-homosexuality bill is being brought back. This is extremely worrying and not the type of law reform that will help us create enabling legal environments which are necessary to ensure all people, including the LGBTI community, are a meaningful part of Ugandan society. Our success hinges on our solidarity. I cannot stress enough the importance of convening and activating our alliances at global and national levels to achieve our goals. The Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of HIV-related Stigma and Discrimination is the ideal platform for our joint work. The partnership aims to accelerate the removal of HIV-related human rights barriers and inequalities by eliminating the underlying stigmatizing and discriminatory practices, policies, and laws across 6 settings: in communities, in the healthcare setting, in the justice sector, in education, at the workplace, and in emergency and humanitarian contexts. The Global Partnership is designed to ensure that communities have a leadership role, working alongside decision makers to end HIV-related stigma and discrimination. 33 countries have already joined the partnership. 18 countries have taken action to advance law reform and/or increased access to justice for key populations. And 7 countries are developing targeted legal and political advocacy campaigns. We need to discuss with politicians, with civil society, and with the media the benefits and challenges of legal reform as a critical piece of making progress against and eventually ending AIDS and other pandemics. We know change takes meaningful and intentional concerted efforts, targeted multi-year funding, and close coordination. But change is also often opportunistic. This calls for all of us to stay vigilant, take advantage of different processes to push through reforms, while ensuring we have built strong foundations for our work. So we know what to do. We have our targets. And we know that failure to reach the societal enabler targets in the UNAIDS global strategy would result in an additional 1.7 million AIDS-related deaths and 2.5 million additional new HIV infections by 2030. We have 3 years to reach our goals, to reach our targets. On this Zero Discrimination Day, let us reaffirm our collective commitments to changing harmful laws and strengthening our strategic partnerships, so we may continue to successfully push for legal change that will translate to millions of lives saved. Tinashe, thanks again and GNP Plus, thanks again for the invitation to join this important event. UNAIDS will remain a strong partner to you all in this work, and I'm looking forward to listening to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy, for such a powerful message. I'm sure we learn from hard-won progress around law reform in specific countries. I'd like to invite Raymond Kolanyane, a human rights activist from LEGABIBO, to present the case study on the landmark law reform case of Botswana decriminalizing homosexuality. Raymond, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Tinashe. Good day, everyone. As aforementioned, my name is Raymond Kolanyane. My pronouns are he, him, and I work in the Policy and Legal Advocacy Department at LEGABIBO, which is in Botswana. And it is my absolute pleasure to be joining you today. I would like to extend my greetings to the Deputy Minister of Justice of South Africa, the Deputy Executive Director for UNAIDS, and our wonderful panel. Protocol is observed. At LEGABIBO, we have a mandate that speaks to reforming policy and law, which is the primary focus of our department, the department that I work in. And it is our job to challenge the anti-LGBT laws in the country. This mandate is the one that has enabled LEGABIBO to become part of the Letsoletsi Motsidimang case, which decriminalized consensual same-sex sexual conduct. As you can see on the screen, that is the history of LEGABIBO for everyone to appreciate. But I will delve into the nitty-gritties of the case. LEGABIBO's decision to become part of the case was due to the observed challenges of the LGBTIQ+ community. And the decriminalization case targeted the sections 164A and C of the Penal Code of Botswana. These laws made it illegal to have carnal knowledge of any person against the order of nature, which primarily means sex with the anus. Allowing another person to have carnal knowledge of you against the order of nature was also criminalized. LEGABIBO made the submission that Section 167 of the Penal Code should also be repealed. Section 167 of the Penal Code of Botswana says it is illegal to commit acts of gross indecency with another person or procuring another person to commit such acts, whether in private or public. The existence of these laws perpetuated stigma in society and made it acceptable to deny the LGBTIQ+ community rights and freedoms. The stigma perpetuated by these laws also speaks to how laws form part of the social contract concept that we as society live by. When something is deemed as illegal, that means that it gives society freeway or leeway to then agree that, you know, we can marginalize this group or said thing. One of the ways that the LGBTIQ plus community was affected by these laws was that it made gay and bisexual and queer men fear accessing sexual reproductive health care due to fear of prosecution. Moreover, providers like service providers use these laws as a basis to deny the LGBTIQ plus community assistance and ridicule them. Healthcare providers would use their personal beliefs to verbally abuse and ridicule the LGBTIQ plus community at these service centers. The existence of these laws also inhibited the dissemination of necessary relevant LGBTIQ plus sex education. It is important that key populations are equipped with information on how to have safe sex and understand their sexual orientation and gender identity. All these factors contributed to the risk of gay men contracting HIV. These laws also enable the LGBTIQ plus community to be extorted and blackmailed by the people who knew they were in violation of these laws. Engaging in sexual conduct that is criminalized also affects the mental health of the LGBTIQ plus community. As the executive director of UNAIDS was just speaking, it is important that people enjoy physical and mental well-being. It is important that people enjoy their right to dignity. But when these laws are present, you cannot enjoy those things. You're always stressed about being prosecuted. So these experiences are why LEGABIBO found it imperative to join the cause to decriminalize consensual same-sex sexual conduct. The decriminalization case was brought before the High Court of Botswana in 2016, and LEGABIBO applied to become amicus curiae, which means a friend of the court. And by LEGABIBO joining as a friend of the court, this helped ensure that the case was going to be successful. Letsoletso Motsidimang, who's the applicant of the case, and his lawyer submitted that sections 164 A and C violated his rights to privacy, liberty, dignity, and non-discrimination as provided for by the Constitution of Botswana. LEGABIBO, in its submissions, made a case for how Section 167 marginalized lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. In 2019, the High Court of Botswana ruled in favor of the applicant and LEGABIBO, affirming the stance that these laws were discriminatory to gay men and violated their rights to dignity, liberty, non-discrimination, and privacy. The High Court also had struck down Section 167, the one that LEGABIBO had submitted, which discriminates against lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. However, after the Attorney General had appealed the case to the Court of Appeal struck down the High Court's decision to strike down Section 167, which violated the constitutional rights of lesbian and queer women, but it did uphold Section 164, which criminalized consensual same-sex between gay men. In the judgment, the Court of Appeal emphasized the importance of recognizing that sex between two men can be an expression of love. It should not be reduced to just a sexual act. The court also recognized that sexual identity and gender identity should be constitutionally protected from discrimination, which is one of the most important aspects of this case. It is important to also note that the success of this case came about by proving to the court through reports that these laws deeply affected the LGBTQ plus community. LEGABIBO used the Biological Behavioral Surveillance Survey of 2012 and 2017 by the Ministry of Health in Botswana to indicate the prevalence of HIV amongst key populations, such as sex workers and men who have sex with men. These reports also show the impact of increased HIV prevalence and risk factors associated with key populations being more prone to contracting HIV, one of those being harmful laws and practices. LEGABIBO and Letsoletso Motsidimang addressed the issues brought about in the Ganane case, which was the first and only case that we've had in Botswana which prosecuted people based on the illegality of consensual same-sex sexual conduct. And in this case, LEGABIBO addressed a number of issues that were brought up in the case. The first being that at the time, this was back in 2001, at the time, the court had said that, Botswana were not ready to decriminalize because, their views had not softened. One other view was that the LGBTIQ plus community in Botswana did not prove sufficiently to need protection from the state. And therefore, in 2001, they denied the decriminalization of this case. But through these reports and through various other ways, both LEGABIBO and the applicants were able to prove that indeed Botswana's views had softened. And in 2011, LEGABIBO, with Kane Young Man, who was the head of policy at LEGABIBO, had registered to decriminalize as well, following the 2001 case. However, they withdrew the case after assessment, and they realized it was not the right time to pursue decriminalization. Since we were approaching the courts, we had to address the issues brought by the Ganani case in 2001. So it was helpful, when there were milestones in between 2001 and 2017 that happened that enabled LEGABIBO to successfully, decriminalize consensual same-sex sexual conduct. And one of those being the registration case that LEGABIBO won. And there were also 2 legal gender recognition cases for the trans community. All these factors show that Botswana was indeed changing, and it was softening its views on the LGBTI community. And these reports by the Ministry of Health also were helpful in decriminalization. LEGABIBO, through these reports, was able to prove that the LGBTIQ community needed protection. The reports showed how laws negatively affected men who have sex with men's access to necessary healthcare. The applicants, together with the amicus LEGABIBO, were able to show that Botswana had also softened and were open to the LGBTIQ plus community. Our mission to be more tolerant as a nation aided in that as well. In the judgment, the court also had said that the public has no interest in what goes on in the privacy of people's bedrooms. I believe this view from the court should not only be applied to consensual same-sex sexual conduct, but it should be extended to sex workers as well. When we approach affording marginalized groups basic human rights with the view that the majority has to concede first, then marginalized groups will likely go unoppressed. The impact of the decriminalizing consensual same-sex sexual conduct can be felt in various ways. To begin with, community leaders, chiefs, and government officials are now willing to engage on sexual orientation, gender identity issues. Since they make the policies, since they make the laws, it is important that they hear and understand the issues affecting the LGBTIQ+ community and ensure that their laws and policies are inclusive. Access to these services is also improved when service providers are now willing to come to the table to have discussions on how to improve, the LGBTIQ+ community access and services. So in this way, the judgment has helped us really build a bridge between service providers and community leaders. We also find that activists are now willing to do the work and create conversation. Before decriminalization, there was a fear to engage in LGBTIQ+-centric advocacy due to fear of prosecution and stigma. It is no secret how advocacy surrounding the LGBTIQ+ community can be very dangerous in some African countries. And the intensity in these countries is as a result of these laws, amongst other things. We find that now we are able to use this judgment in advocacy to involve stakeholders that were not willing to engage on the LGBTIQ+ issues, such as the private sector. The court opening up the non-discrimination clause in the Constitution to also include sexual orientation and gender identity also allowed us to use the judgment during the ongoing constitutional review process to ask that when the Constitution is being reviewed or amended by Parliament, they should include these protections as well for the LGBTIQ+ community. Currently, there is a bill that will be before Parliament on repealing these sections from the case. That is section 164A and C of the Penal Code that discriminates against gay men. However, they did not table the repealing of section 167 that LEGABIBO had tabled, which discriminates against lesbian and bisexual and queer women. LEGABIBO has met with the president to ask him to push for the repeal of this law, and we are waiting further engagement as well as approaching Parliament with the help of a member of Parliament to actually table this bill. But I would like to emphasize the importance of strategic litigation. When we approached this case, we were looking at how things have changed during the years and what we need to say to the courts, because initially the courts were the ones that said, we cannot decriminalize. So it was important for us to assess what had changed and answer the questions that the court had posed and respond to those. So in our heads of argument, we submitted facts and evidence that showed that things had changed, and that's what led to the decriminalization case being born. With that said, I would like to extend LEGABIBO's appreciation for being included in this webinar. Decriminalization does indeed save lives, and we live to see the impact of the case every day in our daily work. We also would like to commend the global network of people living with HIV for honoring this day and continue to improve the lives of key populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raymond. And I think we would also like to celebrate with all the Kenyans, because last week they were also celebrating the registration of an LGBTIQ It's an organization that I think for almost 10 years, it was very hard for them to have the names lesbians, gays as part of their name. But I think we also still have a long way to go. In the past 2 months alone, a Kenyan LGBTIQ+ activist, Edwin, was killed. In Uganda, Major General Takawira asked the healthcare workers to stop treating homosexuals at health facilities. A Kenyan member of parliament submitted a letter to the Speaker of Parliament as he intends to bring legislation to criminalize and punish homosexuality. A religious group in Uganda organized a demonstration against homosexuality in their community. 3 days back in Tanzania, a transgender woman was also killed. This is a lot to digest in only 2 months. And who knows what else lies ahead? If we do not speak up and fight, and if our voices continue to be marginalized and ignored by those in power. I'd like to welcome the South African Deputy Minister of Justice, Honorable John Jeffery, to share with us how the South African government has listened and acted for law reform. The Department of Justice has recently published a draft bill titled the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Bill, nicknamed the Sex Work Decrim Bill, that intends to repeal the legislation that currently criminalizes the sex work industry in South Africa. This is a groundbreaking move, as we know that South African sex workers activists have for the past 25 years advocated for laws to be changed in favor of their health and human rights. Over to you, Honorable John Jeffery. It's now your time.
Thanks, Tinashe. Good. Well, hello, everybody. We're all from different time zones, so let me not make the mistake of saying good afternoon, which is what it is here when it's morning in other places. But thank you for having me. I'm honored to be invited to participate in this event. You wanted me to speak just about the process of decriminalizing sex work in South Africa. As Tinashe has said, there is a bill that was approved by the South African Cabinet in early December last year on decriminalization, and I'll go into more detail about it. It was published for public comment, closing date being the end of January. The comments are now being evaluated. Then the intention is to bring the bill to Parliament, get Cabinet approval to bring the bill to Parliament, and then pass it into law. But just by way of background, sex work has been criminalized in South Africa since I think the start of the European occupation of South Africa in 1652. In the apartheid period, there was a lot of focus by the National Party government on morality. And they had a law called the Immorality Act, which did 2 things. It said basically that white people couldn't have sex with any other race group. And then it also criminalized the selling of sex and brothels and things like that. Obviously, the issue of interracial sexual relations got repealed with the end of apartheid, but the criminalization of sex work continued, including a more recent amendment in 2007 while the process was being looked at to criminalize the buying of sex. However, in spite of that, government has, particularly in attempts to address the HIV and AIDS pandemic, seen the need to engage with sex workers on issues of preventing the spread of HIV and AIDS. So there's a South African National AIDS Council, which is chaired by the Deputy President of the country, and is a sort of coalition of government and civil society organizations. The sex worker sector has always been very active in that. The Department of Health has been calling for sex work to be decriminalized for some time. The South African National AIDS Council has had 2 national sex worker health plans. The first one was 2016 to 2019, where the plan described 6 integrated packages of care for comprehensive sex worker programming and supported the decriminalization of sex work. The second plan was 2019 to 2022, built on the lessons of the previous 3 years. And that then is a third plan that's anticipated to be launched this year. So that's been going on while sex work is criminalized, sex workers have been participating in government structures with government officials. Now, the debate is obviously a difficult one. It's been ongoing since the advent of democracy in 1994. We have the South African Law Reform Commission, which was tasked with doing an investigation into the whole issue of decriminalization. They did that, but unfortunately, they came out with a report about just under 10 years ago, which called for the continued criminalization of selling and buying of sex. That report was released by government. There was discussion within cabinet at the time around cabinet having a position on the issue, but there couldn't be consensus, so there was no position put forward. But in the meantime, there's been increasing levels of violence against women in particular. And that's led to popular campaigns, hashtag not in my name, hashtag total shutdown, and a presidential summit on gender-based violence. And the continued criminalization of sex work has been seen as contributing to gender-based violence. And it's been part of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence by government that sex work should be decriminalized. Also, obviously, there's issues. I mean, I don't need to go into the reasons, I think, for decriminalization in this forum, but the issue of access to healthcare and so on. So that's the context in which we've released the bill. The bill is pretty straightforward. It simply repeals the sections which criminalize the selling and buying of sex, the old 1957 Act, the Immorality Act, and Section 11 of the Sexual Offences Act. The idea is to have a 2-stage process, to start with decriminalization, and then once that is done, because that is urgent, to then look at the issue of regulation. So with the repeal of that legislation, sex work would effectively be decriminalized. That would also be brothels, pimps, etc. But existing laws would still continue. So there would be issues, for example, of children, person under the age of 18, involved in the selling and buying of sex would still be prohibited. Issues of human trafficking of sex workers would still be prohibited. Municipal bylaws relating to soliciting on the streets would still be there. Those are under each separate municipality. Laws relating to running of businesses, so this would apply more to brothels, those would continue. But the key issue would be the selling and buying of sex would be decriminalized. The concern of sex workers that they can't report matters to the police for fear of being legally victimized because of being sex workers would then be put an end to. Obviously, issues of the stigmatization are still issues to look at. So, yeah, and then as I said, the process would be that we see it as urgent to decriminalize the selling and buying of sex. One would then need to engage in the more complex process of looking at what regulations should be there or how things should be regulated. That would need to look at which levels of government should be doing it. We've got a relatively complex system of local authorities, local government having powers, provincial government having powers, and finally national government. So that would have to be negotiated because issues affect particularly local government and national government. But that's basically where we are. In terms of the response from society, it's been, I think, less of a response than I had expected. I think the issue has been debated quite considerably. Obviously, there are people who are opposed to decriminalisation from a moral or a religious perspective, also from an African traditional perspective. And then there would also be people who would be supporting the Nordic model, the Scandinavian model of criminalizing the buying of sex, but decriminalizing the selling of sex. So those are basically the sectors that are in opposition, and we'll have to see how the debate goes. The religious people talk about the fact that they feel selling sex is against God's law, but when it comes to something like adultery, which is something mentioned in the 10 Commandments as being prohibited, adultery has long since ceased to be a crime in South Africa. So people also need to look at the fact that there is a difference between so-called religious crimes and other crimes. But I think what's important is that, and then also there's obviously concern from people about will it increase trafficking in persons, which will still be illegal. And sex workers have raised the issue that decriminalisation will enable them to report possible suspects, possible people who have been trafficked that are selling sex. So yeah, so that's the sort of broad overview of where we are. Hopefully we would in this month or the latest the next month see the bill going into Parliament and starting the parliamentary process. Thanks very much.
Thank you once again to our amazing speakers. And if we do have any questions from those who are watching or listening, please feel free to type your question in the chat box and we will be able to then read it out to our speakers. So far, we have received a question from Sally and it is directed to Raymond. The question reads, for Raymond, you mentioned strategic litigation. This is the only pathway to decrim for so many countries, but it needs consistent funding and persistence. Can you tell us a bit more about the donors who supported your efforts and any advice for others considering the same? Raymond, would you like to answer that question?
Absolutely. I had also typed the response in the chat, but with regards to our funding support, we were working with the Southern African Litigation Center. They provided the funding for us obtaining legal aid in terms of lawyers and drafting the necessary documents and submitting them to court. So that's how they helped. But the relationship also continued beyond just during the case. We continue to work with SALC afterwards to ensure that the LGBTIQ+ community is aware of the judgment, and that community leaders are also aware, as well as healthcare providers, so that we ensure that the discrimination is reduced or we tackle the issue. We also we worked with SALC to also use the case judgment to work on the constitutional review, as I had stated, to ensure that we achieve what the judgment suggested in terms of ensuring that the non-discrimination clause in our constitution protects the LGBTIQ+ community. And the second part of the question speaks to advice for countries looking to do the same. I think it is important to look at each country and see the needs that exist and the problems that exist in that country to say, are the courts going to be willing to listen to the issues if we provide them? Is there research? Are we doing research in countries to show the struggles that exist, and what kind of lessons can we learn from other countries, and what kind of networks can we build to work together and ensure that, because this fight is for all of us, and if we don't work together, then, it won't be an easy road.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Raymond. I have two questions directed to the Deputy Minister of Justice, Honorable John Jeffery. There's a question from Zintle. That's the first question. So Zintle is asking that municipal bylaws are arbitrarily used against sex workers. And so once decriminalization is achieved, what can be done to tackle this issue? Because it's not to say that the bylaws should be removed, but there has to be interventions on how they are used against us. That's the first question, Honorable. Maybe you can respond to that, then I can also read out the second question.
So you don't want to read them both out together, and then I can deal with them both.
Okay, that's perfect. The second question is from Topmore. He is saying that buying and selling of sex to be decriminalized, when will this happen? When exactly can we expect it in the government cycle? Those were the two questions that are directed to you, Honorable John Jeffery.
Thanks very much. I see there was also one on if there's a new government, won't they turn this around? Look, as far as the municipal bylaws, yes, that is the problem, but that is their function. So basically, to try and address, I mean, as I said, we're doing this in two parts. We're doing the decriminalization first, then we will move on to the regulation, which will be, I think, a lot more complicated. And part of the complexity is engaging with local government and their powers. They would have the power to do zoning. They would have the power to basically indicate where, if people want to sell sex on the street, where they can do that. We've not gone into that now, because that would delay the process of decriminalization. But it's something that will have to be done. It would have to be in the second part. It would need to be a broader framework legislation from a national parliament, but still the power as to where sex work can take place, or where people can sell sex if they're selling it on the street. That they would still be determining that. And that's, I think, where it's important for sex workers to continue to be organized, mobilized, and also to have good relations with the communities, because that would make that resolution easier. When will this be happening? Well, the process has started in terms of the bill out for public, well, it was put out for public comment. That's now closed. The intention then is to take it to Parliament next month, and then it would be for the parliamentary processes. We've got a bicameral parliament, so it would have to be passed by both houses, although the National Assembly is the one which deals with things more intensely than the National Council of Provinces. But the intention would be before the end of the term to have the bill passed. Obviously, it depends then in terms of future governments. At least two of the major parties, the ANC and the Economic Freedom Fighters, would support decriminalization. I think the Democratic Alliance would be a little bit more ambivalent on it. They haven't really come out that strongly in opposition. So Yeah, but a lot would depend on what happens in the election. But I think as a country, we're moving forward. There was a case which some people may know about in the Constitutional Court about 20 years ago, the State versus Jordan case, where the issue before the Constitutional Court was whether the criminalizing of selling sex and running a brothel was unconstitutional. The court unanimously found that running a brothel, criminalizing the running of a brothel was not unconstitutional, but they decided by a one-vote majority that selling sex was only by one-vote majority that selling sex was not unconstitutional, putting that, sorry, the restriction on selling sex was not unconstitutional. If this went back to court 20 years later, where I think attitudes have changed, I think there may well be a different outcome. So I think we're moving in a better direction for the protection and promotion of human rights of all groups. Because we see, as government, we see this issue as not promoting sex workers, but basically promoting human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. We have had case studies that speak to the decriminalization of same-sex relationships and decriminalization of sex work. Before we move on to our next panel, I'd like to share a map developed by HIV Justice Network, which brings another angle to our discussion. It highlights all the places where we have seen law reform in terms of criminalization of HIV non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission. You will see in green the countries that have successfully removed or reformed punitive laws aimed at people living with HIV. The other colors, though, highlight the many countries that still have some form of HIV criminalization. We have much more work to do. I want to remind those participating that the HIV Justice Network has done a lot of work to collect information together in HIV criminalization. Their websites includes a database and interactive map on the status of HIV criminalization around the world, as well as many advocacy tools on their HIV Justice Academy microsite. You will hear from HIV Justice Network's Executive Director, Edwin later. Now, to introduce our next session, I'm happy to highlight that our committed panelists, through their role as co-conveners of the Global Partnership or part of the focal country collaboration on eliminating stigma and discrimination, already have a lot to build on in moving our agenda forward. Our panelists are going to share opportunities and tools to push for law reform. In order of our speakers today, I'd like to introduce them. We have got Mandeep Dhaliwal, the Director of HIV and Health Group at UNDP. Mandeep, can you just wave your hand wherever you are? There we go. We also have Marijke, Wijnroks, Head of Strategic Investment and Impact Division at Global Fund. Can you also wave your hand wherever you are? Thank you. We also have Dr. Mamadi Yilla, the United States Global AIDS Coordinator for Multisector Relations and Acting Principal Deputy, United States Global AIDS Coordinator. Unfortunately, she could not be with us in person as we are also joining this webinar during the sidelines of the PEPFAR COP23 co-planning meetings. And it's good that I also acknowledge that in this room, I have live audience that is also cheering me up as we are also discussing this very important topic. We also have Cedric Nininahazwe, the Global Advocacy Manager at GNP+. Cedric, maybe you can also wave your hand wherever you are. Thank you. I'll start with you, Mandeep. The new UNDP PEPFAR partnership to advance progress towards the 10-10-10 targets for key populations in PEPFAR countries aims to look at scaling innovative approaches to counter discriminatory and punitive laws. What is expected in 2023 for this partnership, and what is this new partnership going to achieve, which is different or unique?
Thank you, Tinashe, and it's a delight to be joining everybody on this panel and on this webinar, and thank you to GNP Plus for organizing, and the HIV Justice Network. We are all longtime partners in the fight to eliminate stigma, discrimination, and criminalization in HIV responses. And I want to come to the point of partnership first. I think what we're trying to do with this UNDP PEPFAR partnership is really add to the excellent work that's already going on through many of our partners, like the Global Fund, for example, the work through the Global Partnership, which we talked about, the focal point collaboration, the work that's being supported by PEPFAR, USAID, and others. And most importantly, the work that's being done by communities on the ground. So this is really about additionality. It's about additionality. It's about looking at what works in terms of key population leadership and the leadership of people living with HIV to remove punitive laws, policies, including laws which perpetuate discrimination and obviously the criminalization of people living with HIV and other key populations. So it's really about how do we support the leadership of people living with HIV and other key populations in this space. That's what's new. I think there have been a lot of efforts over the last decade in particular to really highlight the evidence. We know the evidence very well now. And the HIV community can't be like the climate community and be debating the evidence in perpetuum. We know the evidence. We know that we know that removing these laws helps improve access to HIV services. It leads to empowerment. It leads to reduction of stigma and discrimination. So we know the evidence, and what we really want to do in this partnership is take this evidence and really build on it. We want to scale and we want to amplify the voices, the experience, and the leadership of people living with HIV and key populations. We think there needs to be greater investment in key population led responses to remove punitive laws. And we have a historic opportunity with the 10-10-10 targets in the political declaration. And those targets, in the current political environment where we've got pushback, where for every victory there's one step forward and two steps back, especially when it comes to key populations, and you've described some of these examples already. So I think this is a time when there need to be stronger partnerships, stronger collaboration, and stronger support for people living with HIV and other key populations on the ground to really be able to drive progress on these 10-10-10 targets. So that's what the partnership wants to do. We want to, gather the experience and the evidence on what works. And we heard today two excellent examples. We want to build, scale, and amplify the leadership and the capacity of people living with HIV and key populations to do this work. And we really want to increase the investment in people living with HIV and other key populations on the removal of discriminatory and punitive laws and policies, including criminalization. And we're just launching today a call for submissions from people living with HIV and key populations on their experiences and their stories of removing discriminatory and punitive laws and policies. I'll put that in the chat. There will be a series of consultations, and then we will be making small grants to groups of people living with HIV and key populations to take this work forward. Now, what's the role of the UN family in this and the partners? We are here to stand shoulder to shoulder with communities, because the work of changing laws, removing bad laws from the books, and achieving the implementation of protective laws, because it's not just about removing the bad laws, as it were, it's also about ensuring equality and protection in law So we really want to put that, put that squarely in this partnership as well. But the UN, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, we all have a role to play to work side by side to support people living with HIV and other key populations to do this hard work of countering discriminatory and punitive laws and policies. It's going to take all of us working together to be able to make progress on these 10-10-10 targets, which we're very excited about. And I think in particular, we really need to build a movement so that we can go country by country and strike these archaic discriminatory laws off the books and ensure that there aren't other laws. As we heard in the South Africa experience, there are other laws, not just necessarily criminal laws, which can be used to perpetuate stigma and discrimination. So we need to look at the legal environment, as it were, and we need to pass protective laws, and then make sure that they're enforced. So it's a big job, and this partnership is one piece of that. We're part of the mosaic, together with our partners across the joint program, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, and most importantly, together with people living with HIV and key populations. So so this is really a partnership that's about supporting, in a nutshell, the efforts of people living with HIV and key populations to remove punitive and discriminatory laws, including criminalization. And I'll put some stuff in the chat. I hope people will look at it, will make submissions, because we really want to build on and scale and amplify your experiences. So thanks very much. I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much time. I'm looking forward to hearing from my other panelists, and I just want to take a liberty and congratulate Christine and welcome Christine to her new role. So thank you, Tinashe.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think I have a follow-up question. Maybe you also want to add some few things that you might have strongly felt that you might have left out from your previous response. How will be supported to deliver on the 30, 60, 80, and 10-10-10 targets? I know that you also highlighted that briefly. So anything that you feel we should also be able to maybe get out this response as communities.
Yeah, I at the UN, we're a little bit guilty of target bingo. And there are a lot of targets to keep in your heads here. We're focusing squarely on the 10-10-10 targets in this partnership, obviously. And that's why I focused on those. And those 10-10-10 targets, and the way that we're approaching this, which is about directly funding the leadership of people living with HIV and key populations, contributes to those targets, the community targets. So they're not distinct and unrelated. So they are so in the way that we are trying to drive progress on the 10-10-10 targets, we will also be contributing to those targets. And we're really, this is early days. We are being advised by people living with HIV and key population activists who are really doing this work on the ground. So the more we're looking forward to hearing what more we can do. We're looking to expand the partnership in the first year as well. It won't just be PEPFAR. We'll bring other partners to the table. Right now, the focus is PEPFAR countries. With this initial round, but we are looking to expand, and we'll be talking to partners about that. So I guess the short answer is that in the way that we are approaching the partnership, the way we'll be implementing it, that will contribute to both the 10-10-10 targets as the primary ones, and then those also contribute to the community targets which you've laid out, which are also very important. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So I now move over to Marijke. Global Fund has a new strategy with a strong emphasis on the need for law reform. What do you see as the biggest opportunities for making it happen?
Thank you so much, Tinashe, and thank you for having us. I've really been fascinated listening to all the country experiences, and it's clear that We have made progress, but a lot more needs to be done. And it has been very clear from all the interventions that removing harmful laws, policies, and practices is really critical for defeating HIV, for building inclusive systems for health, and for realizing the right to health. And from its very beginning in 2002, the Global Fund has been strongly committed to putting human rights at the center of the health responses that we are funding. And since 2017, our Breaking Down Barriers initiative has been a trailblazer for action. Through this initiative, we have provided matching funds and technical support to 20 countries to catalyze development and implementation of country-owned national programs to address the injustices that continue to threaten progress against HIV, TB, and malaria. The Global Fund human rights investments in these 20 countries have increased more than tenfold, and across our overall HIV portfolio, more than $20 million has been budgeted for programs to reduce human rights barriers to HIV. Very importantly, and also stressed by the importance of partnership stressed by Mandeep, we are working with many partners to drive comprehensive responses to stigma, discrimination, and other human rights barriers, including through the Global Partnership and the focal country collaboration with PEPFAR and UNAIDS. Our new strategy commits us to do even more on human rights and highlights the importance of law reform. Our new strategy also commits us to use our diplomatic voice to challenge harmful laws, policies, and practices. Many countries are working on their funding request as we speak, and I saw someone commenting in the chat about the country dialogue that's happening. And this funding cycle will be a significant opportunity to scale up efforts to remove harmful laws, policies, and practices through the country grants. To encourage countries to prioritize funding and action, we have included law reforms as an HIV program essential, which is something we introduced this cycle. We've highlighted the importance of supporting community-led efforts. Also, through our allocation letter, we have communicated minimum expectations for community engagement across the grant lifecycle. And we count on all of you to engage in the country dialogues and advocate for greater funding for decriminalisation efforts. I truly believe that we do have an opportunity at this moment. Back to you, Tinashe.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Marijke. So I think I also have a second question for you. There is evidence that donor support for comprehensive responses to legal and other human rights barriers at country and regional levels have had some impact, including in contexts with significant barriers. What role can the Global Fund catalytic funding play in supporting scale up of efforts to shift punitive laws?
I think there's already a lot we're doing and more that we can do, and we very much care about the evidence. The Breaking Down Barriers experience, which I just mentioned, it has shown that where there is specific funding and technical support, countries can make real progress in removing long-standing barriers. Catalytic funding has prompted much greater investments and much greater country ownership and commitment, as we've seen through the increased investments in human rights programs within countries' own funding allocations, in addition to the catalytic funding that was made available. We are carefully documenting progress achieved through Breaking Down Barriers so that we can learn lessons and improve programming and outcomes. At the start, we established baseline data for all 20 countries. Midterm assessments have shown that countries were making significant progress in developing and implementing comprehensive national responses. And programs to monitor and reform laws have evolved from one-off time-limited activities at baseline to ongoing actions with greater scope and geographic coverage. Another round of progress assessments is currently underway, and we would be happy when that's finished to report back on that. In these assessments, we've heard from many community and civil society organizations that dedicated funding for legislative and policy advocacy was very rare before Breaking Down Barriers. It was therefore highly valued. By funding organizations led by key populations, the Global Fund supported people with lived experience of criminalization and abuse of law enforcement to raise their voices in advocacy. One lesson learned is that to make progress on human rights and gender-related barriers, there must be movement and action at both the political and the programmatic levels. Breaking down barriers has united stakeholders behind those efforts to confront injustices in national disease programs. It has increased support for key population-led organizations and their allies, and it brought together government and civil society in developing national plans for comprehensive human rights responses. In this new funding cycle, we are maintaining significant human rights catalytic funding, and the Breaking Down Barriers cohort has expanded to 4 new countries: Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Thailand. A key performance indicator will be assessing scale-up of human rights programs in all 24 Breaking Down Barrier countries, so we will be tracking progress. As a co-convener of the Global Partnership to End All Forms of HIV-related Stigma and Discrimination, and a partner in the focal country collaboration, the Global Fund is committed to continue supporting comprehensive responses to stigma and discrimination, as well as stronger community leadership and action. We look forward to continue working with all of you to achieve zero discrimination, remove harmful laws, and save lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marijke. I also encourage participants to share any questions in the Q&A box. As mentioned before, I am moderating this webinar at the sidelines of the PEPFAR COP23 co-planning, where Dr. Mamadi Yilla is. It is very important to mention that PEPFAR is celebrating 20 years of transforming lives and supporting the HIV response. We also had a chance to ask Dr. Mamadi Yilla about resources to push for law reform. More specifically, we asked Mamadi, what do you at PEPFAR see as the biggest opportunity currently to push for law reform at country level? And what do you see as significant barriers that we need to collectively overcome? Given current engagements, we have a pre-recorded response from Mamadi. Over to you, Liseko. I think there is no audio from this end.
As many may know, we are in the midst of our country operational and 2023 co-planning meetings in Johannesburg, South Africa. By the time the Zero Discrimination Day webinar takes place, we would have already begun a robust set of discussions to kickstart the co-planning meetings. We will have begun the conversation to shape PEPFAR's COP and ROP 23. These co-planning meetings will have several objectives, including first to ensure partner governments are familiar with the PEPFAR program under the new 5-year strategy and how it aligns with their own country priorities. And second, to ensure civil society and community organizations have ample opportunity to provide valuable input into the COP 23 process and to help shape these conversations and their outcomes. I want to take a minute to ground my remarks in PEPFAR's new 5-year strategy, because there are a number of components which are directly relevant to and provide the underpinning for how we are thinking about the focus today on Zero Discrimination Day and opportunities to push on law reform. First, PEPFAR's first strategic pillar is a focus on equity. This is first for a reason. It is because it is so central to the Global AIDS strategy that the world endorsed in 2021, and so central to what work we have left to do as we collectively aim to achieve our goals by 2030. Countries must recognize and urgently work to close their inequity gaps. Reaching and effectively supporting populations who are especially vulnerable is always the hardest task for our global health programs. For HIV and AIDS, the largest global prevention and treatment gaps remain in our adolescent girls and young women, our children, and in our key populations. Addressing inequities in these populations will also have an impact on new infections globally. So this work is critical for us all to embrace and support. A focus area under this equity pillar also includes dismantling the structural barriers to HIV/AIDS care. PEPFAR will play a leadership role in supporting collaborative efforts to reach the 10-10-10 goals of the Global AIDS Strategy 2021 through 2026, including by working with partners to address stigma, punitive laws, and gender-based violence, and promote adoption and implementation of enabling policies for equitable and sustained HIV impact as articulated in the UNAIDS Global AIDS Strategy for the world. We will also commit to using PEPFAR-supported platforms to stand up against discrimination, violations of human rights, and to call out inequities in HIV service access, uptake, and continuity, particularly for the populations we mentioned. Those populations of our children, our adolescent girls and young women, and all key populations. Let me define those. These are men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, sex workers, transgender persons, people in prisons, using local data supporting the 95-95-95 and 10-10-10 global goals. We at PEPFAR are committed to working across the entire force of our US government partners and agencies to bring a renewed focus and intensity to this work, both financially and programmatically. In February 2021, President Biden issued a memorandum directing all federal agencies engaged abroad to ensure that US diplomacy and its foreign assistance promote and protect the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons, and that specific agencies engaged abroad are directed to strengthen existing efforts to combat the criminalization by foreign governments of LGBTQI+ status or conduct, and expand efforts to combat discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, and intolerance on the basis of LGBTQI+ status or conduct. Quite simply, stigma, discrimination, and harmful policies continue to fuel gender-based violence, dehumanize key populations, and threaten the entire global AIDS response. We at PEPFAR will be leaning in to close equity gaps and stand with all marginalized populations.
Liseho, I think we have lost sound.
In holding us, PEPFAR, and our partners accountable for HIV impacts. For communities that are increasingly bearing the greatest burden of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, it is critical to ensure that they are leading the conversations on how best to address their own needs. We also know that community leadership must be consistently promoted and championed, and that these kinds of environments must be protected. We are grateful for the work and platform of the Global Partnership for Action to eliminate all forms of HIV-related stigma and discrimination, and the community leadership it has galvanized and championed. As we think about the 10-10-10 targets, in some ways we have to approach it in the same way we have for the 95-95-95 targets. First question, what does the evidence tell us? For example, we know growing and recent evidence demonstrates that HIV prevalence amongst men who have sex with men is higher in criminalized settings. What are we doing to change that? Second, what assessments have been done to understand specific context in a given country? What do legal environment assessments do? Global funds breaking down barriers, human rights assessments. What do these things all tell us? Third, what can be done and acted upon? What are the interventions that can make a difference? Last year, PEPFAR announced a new $3.78 million co-funded collaboration with the United Nations through the UNDP program to further the implementation of the Global AIDS Strategy and counter discriminatory laws that impede key populations' access to HIV services. As I'm sure my colleague Mandeep will have addressed on this panel, the evidence is being assembled on how to counter punitive and discriminatory laws and policies that impact access to HIV services. And the next step is to support communities to do that work and to then monitor success of these efforts so that we can share them globally. In addition, for COP 23, Ambassador John Kengasong just announced an equity fund to the tune of around $40 million that will prioritize proactively remedying health inequities among priority populations and addressing underlying social determinants and systemic barriers that are contributing to the inequity. This fund can be an opportunity to support the structural interventions for key populations and adolescent girls and young women to advance 10-10-10 global targets, including, for example, to support an enabling legal and policy environment, as well as supporting key populations to know their rights relevant to HIV and systems to monitor and address violations and abuse. We call on our youth who are going to be so key to what it is we need to achieve in the future to join us in these efforts. In closing, we know the work ahead will not be easy. It'll take all of us working together in partnership with communities, countries, and all stakeholders to create an enabling policy and legal environment for effective HIV and health programming. We look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamadi, for your message and for PEPFAR's commitment to HIV and to the health and rights for all. I now move over to Cedric Nininahazwe, the Global Advocacy Manager at GNP+. Cedric, so can you tell us who is involved in the Not a Criminal campaign and what does it aim to achieve?
Thanks so much, Tinashe. And first of all, it's a great honor to be here and on this panel with the great people. So the Not a Criminal campaign is led by community, and by community in the context of the campaign, we mean people who are affected by discriminatory and harmful laws and the regulation that criminalize HIV transmission and key population. We are joining forces to hold government and decision makers accountable on their global commitment to ensure access to health and the respect of human rights in the 2021 HIV political declaration. And obviously, community alone is not enough to hold government accountable to their commitment. And community cannot alone cannot influence the change of harmful law. That's why No Criminal Campaign is working closely with partners like UNAIDS, HIV Justice Network, and the Global Partnership, but also Global Fund and UNDP. But again, criminalized community, UNAIDS, Global Fund, HIV Justice Network, and UNDP, we are not enough. Repealing laws and discriminatory law need every human effort. And as Chrissy mentioned in opening remark, we need to take advantage of any opportunity, any process. We need champions like Honorable Jeffery to push for change and hold government accountable. And briefly, Not a Criminal campaign is criminalized community and all stakeholders concerned by criminalization, joining forces to hold government accountable to remove the discriminatory laws.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Cedric. But I'm just curious to know, can a global campaign really concretely help push law reform?
Yeah, good question. Indeed, Tinashe and everyone, as you can imagine, changing law can be a long process, even if you don't have antagonists. And you all know that this is not the case for HIV and key population criminalization. We need strong partnership, and we need allies, we need supporters, and most importantly, we need resources. We need human and financial capacities to push for changing and repealing harmful law. And No Criminal Campaign create solidarity between stakeholders, communities, and everyone who is really concerned about the criminalizations. and through the solidarity, community get access to resources and knowledge they need to advocate and for law reform, and then they can also support mutually. And as again, the solidarity of community and stakeholders create opportunities of funding and advocacy initiative at country level. You just heard Mandeep mentioning this opportunity for key population and people living HIV to leverage and work together to challenge harmful and discriminatory law. And finally, the campaign spotlights how harmful can be the law, and we believe that this will be raising awareness among policymakers and inspire them to repeal discriminatory law. So at global level, we create solidarity, we connect, but also we change the narrative, and we bring people together to unify our forces to challenge criminalization at country level. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cedric, and to all the panelists. I would now like to invite Edwin to give us a closing remark to this important webinar. Over to you, Edwin.
Thanks, Tinashe. Can I just say what an inspiring webinar this has been? Not only wonderful panelists, but I'd also like to acknowledge all the incredible HIV and human rights activists who are attending the webinar. So we all know decriminalization is possible, and it's not easy. But it can and does happen. And it can happen thanks to the strong commitment of the three most important pillars that make change possible. It starts with community leadership. It ends with government commitment and political will. And it happens with the support of the broader UN family, coordinated by UNAIDS, working closely with partners like the Global Fund and PEPFAR. And this is why the global partnership is the ideal mechanism to cement those three pillars together. But what does it actually take to change laws? Successful strategic litigation or law reform doesn't happen in a vacuum. That means not only funding the legal or human rights organizations challenging the laws, but also funding the communities impacted by those laws, supporting people to know their rights, funding the community-based paralegals to help frightened and vulnerable people navigate the harsh realities of the criminal legal system, funding community-based organizations to monitor rights violations, produce shadow reports, and document the evidence of the harms of criminalization, funding community-led training and sensitization of police, of prosecutors and judges, and law and policymakers, and funding the community-based organizations supporting and coordinating the work regionally and globally, creating tools for challenge, including working with the media, where so much of the stigma created by these harmful laws is perpetuated, but can also be where hearts and minds can be changed. So it takes a global village and time, which we don't have much of if we're going to reach those 10-10-10 targets, and money, which we never have enough of. But it's possible and it can happen. And we've heard today about various forms of decriminalization. And you saw the map that Tinashe shared earlier showing that HIV criminalization laws have been reformed or repealed in 15 countries over the past decade, but there's still another 129 countries to go. And although we didn't get to hear today from our colleagues working with people use drugs and in drug policy, over 30 countries around the world have adopted legal reforms to remove the criminalization of certain activities related to drug use. And we've also heard about the many challenges that remain. Yesterday was the second HIV is not a crime day in the United States, and it was fantastic to see so many activities and events raise awareness of an issue that is so close to my heart and which for too long has been underfunded and overlooked. In fact, yesterday, funders concerned about AIDS highlighted that in 2020, only around 0.5% of all philanthropic funding supported HIV decriminalization work globally. And today, the HIV Justice Network and the HIV Justice World Coalition is grateful to the Robert Carr Fund for Civil Society Networks to allow us to ensure that the message that HIV is not a crime is heard, understood, and acted upon globally. But this work, like all decriminalization work, needs more resources. But we also know that decriminalization alone isn't going to address the full complexity of the intersecting stigmas behind the laws and their enforcement. And as with other manifestations of discrimination, The ultimate solution lies in equality and empowerment. This is a marathon, not a sprint, and dismantling systems that have been built over decades that oppress people living with HIV and key populations takes time. So we heard from the South African Deputy Ministry of Justice about the sex work decrim bill, and we and many others in our global network have written letters of support to the South African government welcoming this change. This Friday, the 3rd of March, is International Sex Workers' Rights Day. So let's make sure South Africa knows the world is watching and that South African sex workers know we have their back. HIV is not a crime, and sex work shouldn't be a crime either. Let's use our collective power across all social media, and on hashtag Zero Discrimination Day, let's use the hashtags sex work is work and HIV is not a crime.
Thank you so much, Edwin. Thank you, all speakers and all participants. We have heard the message loud and clear. Law reform is possible and must happen if we are to ensure the health and rights for all. Thank you again for all your solidarity, and it has been a pleasure to be moderating this webinar. So from myself, Tinashe, grateful Rufurwadzo, and the amazing crew behind the scenes and all partners, it's goodbye for now.
Thank you, Tinashe.
Thank you, sir.